Vietnam stretches 1,650 kilometers from north to south, but at its narrowest point, it is only 50 kilometers wide. That is a length-to-width ratio of over 30 to 1. No other country on Earth comes close. Most people assume the mountains made it that way, that the shape is just a quirk of geology. But for most of its history, Vietnam was only a small kingdom in the far north. The S shape you see on every map today was built, one conquered coastline at a time over 400 years of war. The mountains explain the corridor. They do not explain who decided to walk the entire length of it. To understand how that construction happened, you have to start with the land itself, because the land decided the rules. The Annamite Range runs roughly 1,100 kilometers along Vietnam's western flank, parallel to the coast. It is not the tallest mountain chain in Asia. Peaks here rarely break 2,500 meters, but height is not the point. What the Annamites do is act as a continuous wall, separating the Mekong River basin from the South China Sea. On the inland side, Laos and Cambodia, river systems draining west toward the Mekong and eventually the Gulf of Thailand. On the coastal side, a narrow ribbon of lowland squeezed between mountains and ocean. In central Vietnam, that ribbon pinches to just 50 kilometers. Drive from the mountains to the sea and you can do it in under an hour. In places, the foothills practically tumble into the surf, cliffs dropping straight into waves, with barely enough flat ground for a road and a row of houses. This corridor is the geological skeleton of the country, a long, thin hallway with stone on one side and water on the other. Every road, every rail line, every city in central Vietnam is crammed into this strip. The National Railway threads through tunnels cut into coastal headlands because there is simply nowhere else to put it. The terrain did not just influence where people settled, it dictated it. There was no room to spread sideways. You could only go north or south. Picture a cross section. On the left, the Annamite ridgeline. Dense jungle, steep slopes, rivers cutting westward into Laos. On the right, the South China Sea. Between them, a band of flat ground barely wider than a few dozen kilometers. That band runs for over 1,000 kilometers. It is the longest natural corridor in Southeast Asia, and it set the rules for everything that followed. Whoever controlled the corridor controlled the coast. Whoever controlled the coast controlled the trade routes linking China, India, and the Spice Islands. The mountains did not just shape the land, they shaped ambitions. But a hallway is useless without someone at one end deciding to walk it. And for most of history, the Vietnamese were only at one end. Vietnamese civilization began in the Red River Delta, a broad fertile floodplain in the far north, anchored by present-day Hanoi. Wet rice cultivation sustained dense settlement here going back to at least the 3rd millennium BCE. The delta's flat, waterlogged paddies could feed enormous populations per square kilometer, and they did. Villages packed the lowlands, dike systems held back floods. Irrigation channels threaded between fields in patterns so intricate they looked planned from above. For centuries, this was all of Vietnam, a compact northern kingdom clustered around one river system. The political story of that era was not expansion, but survival. Chinese dynasties ruled the region for over 1,000 years, and Vietnamese resistance defined the culture. Independence, when it came, was hard-won and fiercely guarded. Confucian institutions shaped governance. Buddhist temples rose alongside rice paddies. The kingdom looked north toward China, sometimes as adversary, sometimes as model, and rarely looked south. The Red River Delta was Vietnam's anchor, its breadbasket, its political heart. Everything south of it, the entire central coast, the Mekong Delta, the territories that make up 2/3 of the modern country, belonged to someone else. So if Vietnam started as a small kingdom in the north, who controlled the rest? South of the Vietnamese core, two civilizations controlled the land. Along the central coast sat the Cham Kingdom of Champa, Hindu-influenced, seafaring controlling vital trade ports that connected the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea. Cham towers still dot the Vietnamese coast today. Their red brick spires rise from hillsides and river valleys, remnants of a civilization that thrived for over 1,000 years. Champa was not a backwater. It was a maritime power, its ports bustling with merchants from India, China, and the Malay world. Farther south, The Mekong Delta and its surrounding lowlands were frontier zones of successive Khmer empires, the same civilization that built Angkor Wat. The Khmer had carved canal systems through the delta's wetlands, turning swamp into productive rice lands centuries before the Vietnamese arrived. These were not empty lands waiting to be claimed. They were populated, governed, and culturally distinct. The Central Coast had Cham temples and harbors. The Mekong had Khmer paddies and waterways. Vietnam's modern S shape runs directly through what were once two foreign countries. That sets up the tension. A compact northern kingdom hemmed in by mountains with a 1,000-kilometer coastal corridor stretching south, occupied by rivals. The hallway existed. The Vietnamese had not yet entered it, and if you want to see how they did, subscribe and stick around, because in 1471, everything changed. The next 400 years would transform a compact northern kingdom into one of the strangest shaped countries on Earth. In 1471, Vietnamese forces under King Le Thanh Ton marched south and sacked the Cham capital of Vijaya. It was not a raid, it was an annihilation. The Cham kingdom, weakened by decades of border wars and internal fractures, never recovered as a major power. The remaining Cham polities fragmented into smaller coastal enclaves, and Vietnamese settlers and officials flooded into the conquered territories. Farmers followed soldiers, administrators followed farmers. Temples were repurposed, ports were absorbed, and the Cham cultural landscape began to disappear under a wave of Vietnamese migration. This was the beginning of Nam Tien, the march to the south, a process that historians say more than tripled Vietnamese territory over the following centuries. But here is the critical detail. Because of the Annamite range, expansion could only follow the coastal corridor. Vietnam did not expand in a circle the way most empires grow, pushing outward in every direction from a central core. It expanded in a line, absorbing one narrow strip of coastline after another, like a snake swallowing its prey lengthwise. Each conquest added another segment to the S. Each segment made the country longer and thinner. The mountains enforced the geometry. There was no shortcut inland, no wide frontier to fill. Just the corridor, stretching southward, one captured port and river mouth at a time. The shape of the country was not an accident of nature. It was the product of centuries of deliberate conquest, channeled by geology into a single direction. And the march did not stop at Champa's borders. The Nguyen lords kept pushing, all the way to the Mekong. From the 16th to the 18th centuries, the Nguyen lords, warlords who nominally served the Vietnamese emperor but operated as independent rulers in the south, drove settlement down the coast and into the Mekong Delta. They encouraged migrants to reclaim wetlands and forest, draining swamps and building dikes to turn waterlogged lowlands into productive rice paddies. The Mekong Delta was vast, flat, and staggeringly fertile. Given enough labor and enough drainage, it could feed millions. By the mid-1700s, the Nguyen had seized key Cambodian frontier zones, including coastal districts along the Gulf of Thailand. Locking in the southern curve of the South Vietnamese settlers poured into the delta by the tens of thousands. They dug canals through mangrove swamps, cleared forest, and planted rice on land that had been wild a generation before. The Mekong Delta, once Khmer territory, became Vietnam's second great breadbasket, mirroring the Red River Delta 1,000 miles to the north. Two deltas, connected by a thin mountain-hugging corridor. That is the architecture of Vietnam. One breadbasket in the north, one in the south, and a narrow hallway stitching them together. The shape that looks so strange on a map is actually a logical consequence of where the fertile ground was and what kind of terrain connected it. Remove either delta, and the country loses its economic foundation. Sever the corridor, and you split the nation in half. A vulnerability that would prove devastatingly real in the 20th century. But at its peak, Vietnam was actually much bigger than the country you see on maps today. Under Emperor Minh Mang. In the early 1800s, Vietnam's territory was roughly 1.7 times larger than modern Vietnam. At its high water mark, the Nguyen dynasty controlled not just the coastal S but large swaths of inland territory, much of present-day Laos and significant parts of Cambodia. The empire stretched deep into the Mekong Basin, far west of the Annamite Range, into jungles and river valleys that had never been part of the coastal corridor. But those inland territories did not last. Administering land on the far side of a mountain range, land with different rivers, different peoples, different loyalties, proved far harder than holding the coast. Rebellions flared in the Lao Highlands. Cambodian resistance stiffened as Khmer rulers refused to accept Vietnamese suzerainty. Supply lines stretched thin across mountain passes that turned to mud in the monsoon and froze shut in winter. The Nguyen court could project power along the corridor, where coastal roads, ports, and river mouths linked the chain together. It could not hold territory that the mountains themselves cut off from the core. What survived was the coastal spine, the strip defined by mountains on one side and the sea on the other. The corridor endured because the corridor was defensible. The inland gains evaporated because they were overextended. Geography kept what geography had always favored. Vietnam shrank back to the shape the land had always preferred, long, thin, and coastal. And then the French arrived and froze the S shape permanently. French conquest in the 19th century reorganized Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia into French Indochina. Colonial administrators were not interested in Vietnam's historical shape. They wanted ports, plantations, rubber, and river systems they could tax. But their treaty lines locked in the south. Agreements with China in 1887 and 1895, combined with the earlier annexation of Mekong Delta provinces, formalized Vietnam's borders along the mountain spine and river frontiers that had been fluid for centuries under dynastic politics. Boundaries that Vietnamese and Khmer rulers had negotiated, fought over, and shifted for generations became fixed international borders on European maps. Cartographers in Paris drew lines that diplomats in Hanoi and Saigon would spend the next century defending. The shape that took 400 years to build was frozen in place by a foreign power in a matter of decades. But the most dramatic consequence of that shape was still coming. Because in 1954, someone drew a line across the narrowest part of the country. The 1954 Geneva Accord split Vietnam at the 17th parallel, right at the country's narrowest point. The already thin waist of the S was sliced in two. The demarcation line ran along the Ben Hai River, marked by the Hien Luong Bridge, a span that became one of the most symbolically loaded structures of the Cold War. North Vietnam and South Vietnam, two states carved from a shape that was already geographically extreme. The partition turned Vietnam's narrowness from a logistical headache into a strategic fault line. Every supply route, every troop movement, every infiltration path during the Vietnam War was shaped by the fact that the country was a corridor and the corridor had been cut. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, winding through Laotian and Cambodian jungle to bypass the partition, existed precisely because the mountains and the narrow waist made direct north-south movement through Vietnamese territory nearly impossible under enemy fire. The shape did not just frame the war, it dictated how both sides fought it. Reunification in 1975 restored the S, but the scar of the partition still marks the landscape and the national memory. And today, that same shape still dictates Vietnam's fate. Modern Vietnam's population and infrastructure are concentrated in two places: the Red River Delta in the north and the Mekong Delta in the south, connected by that thin coastal strip exposed to typhoons and rising seas. The North-South Railway, the Reunification Express, takes over 30 hours to travel the full length of the country on a single narrow-gauge line. One major highway links the two ends. When typhoons slam the central coast, and they do regularly, the country's transportation spine can be severed for days. The S shape means Vietnam is one of the most climate-vulnerable nations on Earth. Most of its people live in flood-prone lowlands at either end of a corridor that barely rises above sea level. The Mekong Delta, which produces roughly half of Vietnam's rice, is sinking, and saltwater is creeping inland. The Central Coast, the thinnest part of the corridor, absorbs the full force of Pacific storms with almost no buffer. But the same elongation that creates vulnerability also produces extraordinary internal diversity. Northern Vietnam has cold winters, PHO, and Confucian traditions rooted in centuries of Chinese influence. Southern Vietnam has tropical heat, sweet flavors, and a frontier culture shaped by centuries of migration. Central Vietnam has its own cuisine, its own accent, its own identity, forged in the narrowest part of the corridor where life has always been hardest. Different climates, different crops, different ways of speaking, all within a country that is sometimes only 50 kilometers wide. Vietnam is simultaneously one of the most geographically constrained and one of the most internally varied countries in the world. The shape that took centuries to build now defines every challenge the nation faces. The Vietnamese government describes its own country as an S-shaped strip of land. Tourism campaigns liken the outline to a rising dragon, its head in the north, its tail curving through the Mekong Delta. A shape that was carved by mountains, conquered through 400 years of war and migration, frozen by colonial treaties, and split by Cold War politics, has become a point of national pride. Most countries are shaped by rivers or coastlines or the arbitrary lines of colonial administrators. Vietnam is shaped by all of those things, plus a geological corridor that allowed only one direction of expansion and a civilization stubborn enough to walk the entire length of it. No other country was built this way. That is why no other country looks like this. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, check out the recommended videos on your screen right now and subscribe for more.